Thank you all for joining us over these next 2 days of conversation. We're most honored and excited to have you all here. When I was watching people come in, there are members of the audience who have come from France, from Copenhagen, from all over the world, and that's really exciting. Jill and I have decided to divide the introduction into 2 parts. My purpose here is to provide a broad picture of the field in which we're situating the next 2 days' discussion and to raise some general points for conversation. And then Jill will carry on by proposing some tactics for practice and challenges that we hope to provoke. In the wake of the global turn, started from the desire to look back on over 10 years of work on the possibilities of a global art history, a critique of Eurocentric priorities and presumptions of the discipline that itself emerged with various degrees of engagement from 25 or more years of thinking about postcolonial theory and art history and visual culture. In the call for papers we sent out for the conference, we proposed a set of questions that, to our minds, seem to arise from this work and also from the Clark's own international initiatives, questions having to do with the definitions of the global itself, to the pressures on art history, even when focused on canonical subjects, to open itself to the effects of the expansion of the field, to new models to think about cultural flows, exchanges, and reversions, to issues of the temporal and geographical disjunctions in how we conceive our practice, to questions about whether the so-called problems that have been identified with the project are, in fact, productive in and of themselves, and thus worthy of attention in a positive sense. What would it mean to understand the global turn as something that does not merely expand, but potentially explode the borders between fields as well, and maybe even the discipline itself? What methods, research practices, and models might serve not just a decentered, but also a reoriented practice of the global, one that reckons with radical difference, unevenness, and even the untranslatable? At stake in all of this, too, is how we, the conveners of the conference, have chosen to address the assembled grouping of scholars, students, and other interested parties in the audience with the second-person pronoun, not with the intention of imagining that we are a unified body, adhering to a single vision of art history, or even more broadly to a single vision of visual culture, but rather to suggest that all of us, from our positions as individual thinkers in the world, are ethically obligated to ask these questions of our own practice, whatever the answer we eventually come to. Even more important is that whatever the answer in my last statement, and that's crucial here, all of the questions we have posed in our brief for the conference are intended to be open-ended ones. It's subject to interrogation, challenge, debate, and even rejection. The papers that you will see presented here do not and were not selected to demonstrate or illustrate the propositions put forth in these introductions. We hope, in fact, that they will serve to dislodge some of these questions when necessary and put other questions into play. That is not to say that the questions themselves do not carry within themselves a set of assumptions. All questions do. Ours have to do with an interest in the political stakes of intellectual practice and our own positions as scholars within the field, given this global turn, especially within a discipline whose shape has changed considerably since the leveling of postcolonial and feminist and queer and post-structuralist critiques in the 1980s and 1990s. In other words, it's changed precisely because of those critiques. But it is a model of politics that is different from that imagined by an earlier moment in art history's history, one that must address not just shifting, but also decentered and sometimes unlocated networks of power, not always easily mapped onto the West and the rest, East, West, North, South, whatever the binaries one might use, for example. And one that sees the irresolvable frictions, disunities, and incommensurabilities, and the agonistic, not as problems or roadblocks for intellectual discourse around the issues of the global, but as productive and energizing cross-currents. In this, we may be asking for the impossible, to quote Judith Butler in her statement at Occupy Wall Street last week. But we demand the impossible, at least for today and tomorrow. So I'll now turn to map the major trends that bring us to this event. On the one hand, one might trace the ways in which the goal of an expanded model of art history emerged from postcolonial studies. From, that is, an awareness after Edward Said's signal work on Orientalism in 1977 that the discourse of art history was part of a larger drive to manage fears provoked in the Western subject by the cultural other. This awareness, along with a similar one emerging from feminist theories of the subject, led to a questioning of the terms of our discipline and an articulation of its blind spots. Art history as a modernist entity was predicated on the exclusion of others, whether otherness was defined in gendered, sexual, racial, a term which was itself deconstructed by scholars of postcolonialism and critical race studies, class, or ethnic terms. While this trajectory within visual studies led to an increased attention to those marginalized by an earlier art history, and even led to a range of overviews, texts, and exhibitions that addressed the forgotten and the non-canonical, it did not have the ambition of creating a unified, univocal global art history. There was, and still is, no sense that a single disciplinary form would be adequate to the task. And in fact, it is more common among writers most active in this line of thinking to advocate a radical interdisciplinarity, albeit one that continues to pay attention to the specificities of form, style, etc., in order to be adequate to the task of thinking through art practice across cultural and temporal divides. Warning that the presentation of non-Western art objects in blockbuster exhibitions may in fact do more to occlude or obscure the artistic traditions of countries that experienced colonialism and imperialism, Cobbin and Mercer asks a question that seems to put the very project of a comprehensive history of art in doubt. In a situation, quote, and I'm quoting here, in a situation where the aspiration to be all-inclusive has become the official watchword of institutional policy, has the very idea of inclusion now become a double-edged sword? Another trajectory that has generally come to be known as global art history or world art history by turns, although these are not entirely interchangeable, has emerged. This approach has addressed itself broadly to finding tools of analysis that can be expanded across the globe to eventually create a more or less complete picture of art production. It is a project, contra Mercer, of radical inclusiveness. In some cases, this has been pursued by looking within art history's foundational texts themselves, Panofsky, Wolflin, Riegel, Gombrich, others, to find the salient overlooked moments within those foundational texts that might offer an internal solution to the problem of the global. One might think here of Thomas DaCosta Kaufman's work on the geographies of art, or Whitney Davis's recent A General Theory of Visual Culture as examples of this approach. In other cases, there has been an attempt to take up the legacy of Abby Vorberg's Niemesign project with quantitative methods derived from the social sciences to create an art historical version of the literary critic Franco Moretti's work on the novel as a planetary form. John O'Nions' Atlas of Art is an obvious example here. Most eccentric, to my mind at least, are those projects which search for their common terms in the very organization of our brain, the NeuroAesthetics approach promoted by John O'Nions and the University of East Anglia's School of World Art Studies and Museology, which he founded. In this latter thrust, the neural organization of the brain is understood to be a grounding and unifying term of world art production, and the cultural products of the last 4,000 years, though they might differ widely in their forms and though they might have been pressured by different cultural constructs, can more or less be explained by the way our brains process visual information. And as a side note, following the work of David Sloan Wilson, there has been a similar move towards evolutionary explanations for human cultural production recently as well. But there are other ways of imagining such unifying structures. Hans Belting, for example, along with Andrea Budenzeig, has taken up the problem of the global art museum and ancillary to the project of global art history, but from a particular definition of the global as an exclusively contemporary phenomenon, one which exists only in the age of international biennials and museums of contemporary art. Here, the historical punctuality of our moment is what allows us to find common terms for art critical analysis. David Summers, on the other hand, theorizes something called the spatial arts, a term that might account for and put on an equal footing art from all cultures and time periods. A third trajectory, this time finding its common ground not in the foundational texts of art history or in social science-based explanatory models, but on the object itself, that last term in quotation marks, has emerged in the writings, for example, of David Carrier, who advocates rejecting the narrative mode of historical writing by presenting instead writings around significant works that eschew causal connections or timelines in order to break out of the most intransigent and limiting structures of Western art history. This, too, is the approach taken by the British Museum's History of the World in 100 Objects, a BBC radio series from 2010 that is still available as podcasts and now as a book. The objects in this History of the World range from prehistoric chopping tools found in Tanzania to a David Hockney print to an Edwardian penny defaced with a pro-suffrage slogan. There exists in this and other projects of this type an understanding that the object determines what can be said about it, and even further that the object exists as a pre-existing entity rather than something always already constituted in discourse. The focus on the object, in any case, is seen as a way of breaking out of Eurocentric paradigms, says Neil MacGregor, the director of the British Museum, who is the narrator of this History of the World in 100 Objects. In all other museums, European pictures overrule the rest of the collection. It means that we are the only one of these encyclopedic museums, because it's based on its collection consists mostly of objects. We're the only one of these encyclopedic museums where Europe is not dominant in the narrative. That's a huge advantage if you're trying to make sense of the world, end quote. Tony Bennett, in his article World as Exhibition, challenges the notion that art history is solely a discipline in the Foucauldian sense of the term. In Douglas Crimp's words, an institution of confinement that articulates power and knowledge. Instead, Bennett sketches out what he calls an exhibitionary complex, in which art history participated along with 19th century institutions of display, the museum and the international expositions, in creating a spectacular image of the world. Just like the microcosmic presentations of national pavilions at the universal expositions of the 19th century and 20th century that allowed the visitor to take the world in at a glance, to manage anxieties over cultural, racial, and ethnic difference, to manage doubts about the various colonial adventures of European empires, to see themselves from the side of power, both as the subjects and objects of knowledge, to know themselves ideally as known by power. Art history's drive to put the whole world in a book, this branch of art history's drive to put the whole world in a book, should be considered, according to Bennett, as a way of taming the challenges posed by this world of shifting geographical loci of power. The question then is whether a model of art history's expanded field constitutes a meaningful shift, or merely replaces one master narrative with another, albeit one that is motivated by a commitment to multicultural pluralism rather than a hegemonic patrolling of the disciplinary boundaries of art history. In the face of these potential pitfalls, voices have emerged that are both committed to the discipline of art history to some degree or another, as one worth retaining, as well as acutely aware of what is seen as the near impossibility of finding those common terms that might allow for a true expansion of the discipline. Jim Elkins, one of our moderators, is perhaps the most visible of these scholars. Keith Moxie, who's also in the audience, whose writings question the possibility of truly, within the terms of art history, mapping a history of multiple modernities. Okwe and Wezor, whose work, though articulated in a global context, believes still on national models of counter-canon building as a productive kind of process. And Jonathan Harris, who has seen the curatorial engagement on the part of Euro-American institutions with contemporary global art as a form of identity theft or cultural colonization, are also important voices here. I don't mean to collapse all of these things, but I'm sort of broadly mapping. One of the questions raised by Elkins and others is whether, given the fact that art history is premised on a set of philosophical bases that are irredeemably Eurocentric, the Kants, the Hegels, the Heideggers, art history will ever be able to adjust its terms so that scholars writing on non-Euro-American art are not simply trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, or such that scholars who themselves operate in the non-West are not performing a sort of mimicry by adopting a scholarly language that is canted against their full participation in the discipline. Because this last is probably closest to the set of propositions that Jill and I are putting forward in these two introductions, it is worth taking a moment to articulate the differences that motivate our premises. Many of the scholars, and there are many, who lament the possibility of an art history as we know it, that is adequate to accommodating art from around the globe, base their arguments to different degrees on three assumptions, all of which we are interested in examining more closely. First, that there are common terms around which Western art history itself operates, especially after the feminist postcolonial visual studies-based and Marxist critiques that have already reshaped the field profoundly over the past 3 decades. This is especially apparent in discussions, it seems to me, of Western modernism, which is often imagined as a more hegemonic discourse in the West than was historically or even discursively the case. Second, that the search for adequate theories and methods must precede work in practice instead of emerging from it, though it would not be hard to imagine that objects and art practices from other sites and moments might offer clues as to how they might be spoken of in art history or spoken in art history. Rarely are scholars who are working on, say, African or Asian-centered models of art history held up as conceptual models for how the art history of the West might be written. This could be either because such work is seen to sort of participate in the academic strictures of Western art history, or because it does not look like art history as we have come to know it, often looking more like art criticism or aesthetic theory rather than art history as such. And third, the assumption that art history is still a Western discourse and will continue to be such. In his introduction to an anthology of Indian authors who choose to write in English, Salman Rushdie addresses those critics coming from within India who lament the adoption of the colonizer's language by the formerly colonized. Rushdie's response, to paraphrase, because he's very flip, so I'm paraphrasing in a more respectful way, is when does the English language cease to be owned by the English? When will it be acknowledged that it can be put to different uses and set to different ends? When do we start to recognize it as the language of the formerly colonized and not simply the language of the colonizer? The same question might be asked of the language of art history. How much does the anxiety over the supposed Westernness of the discipline occlude the possibility that we are, as art historians, already speaking a global language, albeit without a sense of self-consciousness or perhaps self-criticality, and that we are not the only ones? To say that art history might already be a global language is not to say that it is a unified one. Though the language of neoliberal economic globalization, the context often unacknowledged in which this discourse of global art histories emerges, hinges on the notion of a near-perfect translatability of money, a frictionless skating of labor, capital, and goods over a flat earth, in Tom Friedman's locution, the process of globalizing our discipline has been and should be an attendance to the frictions that arise from cross-cultural, transnational, and networked encounters over space and time. These frictions, we propose, are not a bad thing. Bad for neoliberal economics, perhaps, which needs its fantasy of the frictionless, a fantasy enacted in ways that occlude or repress, sometimes violently, anything that might interrupt or oppose it. But perhaps not at all bad for cultural practitioners who are searching for ways to distinguish their work from the economic structures in which they operate. A literary example might be instructive here. In Amitav Ghosh's Sea of Poppies, a novel from 2008, we read a story of encounter, the arrival of a former slave ship now outfitted for the opium trade. The slave ship is filled with mercenary sailors from around the globe and lands up in Calcutta to do business with the British soldiers and the Bengali peasants and workers who take part in the enterprise of transporting labor, drugs, and eventually soldiers to fight in the opium wars, not to mention a French orphan and a bankrupt Raja. Ghosh, a linguist as much as a novelist, pays particular attention to the dialects and pidgin languages spoken by each character. The almost impossibly hybrid languages of the sailors on the ship, a mishmash of varieties of Chinese, Malay, English, Portuguese, Indian, and African tongues, the strikingly foreign-sounding British colonial English with its inconsistent adoption of Hindi and Bengali terms, and the English adopted by Indians and French with varying degrees of fluency. The reader is left as bewildered as the characters themselves, left to make their way through the thicket of words without the benefit of a translator, for Ghosh offers little by way of assistance. At certain points, it is only the common use of curse words that provides any guidance as to whether one is looking at a noun, a verb, or an adjective, although, as George Carlin famously pointed out, that's not always a reliable guide either. The book asks us to imagine ourselves in a world with only the merest wisp of a common language, an English that has been forced in myriad directions by the needs of its speakers. And in the end, the story, rather the stories for each character comes with one, gets told, and we understand enough so that all these people more or less find their way toward what they are looking for. One might, to end, one might note the shift in terms that has happened over the course of these remarks, from expansion to friction, and now, to cite what has been the most remarked upon term in the title of this conference, to explosion. The word was not lightly chosen and came after much discussion. This conference comes at a critical juncture for the fields of art history and visual culture studies, as the question of the global shakes their practices and assumptions at their very core, and it was a term that seemed adequate to that fact. Exploded takes the place of other X words, expansion, of course, but also extraneous and exotic and even exogamous, all terms that have, in large part, guided the project of art history's long engagement with the cultural other, with a term that insists on problematizing, even undoing the divisions between center and periphery, inside and outside, core and supplement. More than that, the exploded explodes. It is a speech act that enacts, that is performative in the sense of J.L. Austin's definition of the performative utterance. As such, it raises the question of the ways in which our practices, even when untheorized, make the field and its objects. Finally, the word exploded quite deliberately puts into play something of the violent, not only raising the specter of uncontrolled and uncontrollable forces, but also putting into circulation fears of the global and the ways that it has been shaped by discourses and practices of terror, terrorism, and state-mobilized war. It is meant to insist on confronting the problems and the promises of the ways in which art history is implicated in this other vision of the global. It proposes that we cannot think the global for the fields of art history and visual cultures, visual studies, solely in terms of utopian visions, but that we must confront the contested, fraught, and politically charged investments in other, less comfortable versions of the global that are clearly operative in this world of ours. Thank you.